So choosing which army to play in 40k is one of the biggest decisions that you have to make when you're starting the game. In this video we'll talk about every single faction and some of the pros and cons of playing them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. I'm making this one as an update to my previous video. Now we have 9th edition, and for a brief time before the codexes start dropping, most of the armies are at some sort of level playing field, at least updates wise, though perhaps not for power in game. In the video we'll start by talking through a few general principles when collecting 40k armies, and then go through each and every faction in turn, talking briefly about their lore, the quality of the miniatures in their range, their playstyle, relative power, and how expensive they are to play. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump straight on into it. I think there are quite a lot of factors that make people choose one army over another. You might like the look or aesthetic of the army and the models that they have in their range. You might be drawn to the lore and background of the army, and the way that they make war might particularly resonate with you. They might have some particularly interesting game mechanics, such as Sisters of Battle Miracle Dice or Death Guard Disgustingly Resilient Feel No Pain, you think would be cool to play around with on the tabletop. I think at least some people have a nod to which army is strongest in the game at the moment, with the stronger armies tending to pick up more new players, though I would bear in mind that this canon does change fairly rapidly, based on new updates in codexes and chapter approved. And finally you might have a bit of a nod to the price of the army. Some factions are just significantly more expensive to play than others, partly due to the number of models you might need for a faction, or whether or not Games Workshop do good discount deals for them. When you're starting, I'd bear in mind that Warhammer can be quite expensive. I'd recommend expanding in small jumps rather than buying a huge army all at once. It'll take some time to get some models on the table and painted up, and also get familiar with the lore and gameplay of a faction, which might guide you a bit more on future purchases rather than if you just bought everything all in one big go. As I said, with collecting a faction, I really do like the game mechanics myself, but I think it's also important to buy a faction that you like the look and feel of the army as well. Nothing's going to be top dog forever, and game mechanics do change as well, and it would be a bit sad to invest loads of time and effort in an army to have something that you're not particularly happy about when the game and the power level moves on. Finally, I would bear in mind that occasionally older style models get replaced or updated. In general, newer style plastic kits will have a bit more longevity and less chance of Games Workshop issuing a new kit for them if you are thinking about getting into Warhammer for the long run. Finally, if you are starting 40k, bear in mind that there might be places that you can get models at a discount. For example, in the UK there are plenty of discount retailers which will stock all Games Workshop's Warhammer products for 10 to 20% off. I do have a link to Element Games in the video description, which is one of the ones in the UK, though there are plenty of others available, and certainly consider supporting your local gaming store if you have one. Just as a quick overview, here are most of the armies available in Warhammer 40k. Broadly aligned into 3 main themes: the Imperium of Man, the sprawling empire of humanity in the 40k galaxy, for whom the poster boys are the iconic Space Marines, although there are plenty of other Imperial military organisations, such as the Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard, and the mechanised forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus. All of these armies can ally with each other, so there is an element of being able to mix and match if you want to. Then we have Chaos, the various followers of the Dark Gods, of which the most iconic are the Chaos Space Marines, the ones who turned from the Emperor's light in the Horus Heresy, and also the very forces of the Warp themselves, the Chaos Demons. Then we have the Xenos factions, the Imperium's term for the alien races, the Space Elves of the Eldar, the forces of the Tyranids and the Genestealer Cult followers, Orks, Necrons and Tau. So let's get into some actual reviews of the armies. We'll start out with the Superhuman Space Marines, who in the background are genetically engineered super soldiers, created by designs from the Emperor himself, clad in the best armour and armed with the finest war gear that the Imperium can muster. They wear enormous suits of ceramite power armour and purge their foes with the explosive shells of the Holy Bolt Gun, and definitely have a bit of a knightly orders and space theme going on. Each chapter tends to have its own fortress monastery on a planet, and numbers around 1,000 battle brothers. Space Marines are just superior to humans in every way with multiple genetic upgrades, and tend to be far more elite than the basic troopers of other races. Each Space Marine chapter tends to draw themes from the real world, particularly from historical forces. Possibly the most well known are the Ultramarines, the ones you can see on the right here, who have a bit of a Neo-Roman vibe going on. There are the White Scars, Khan-led bike enthusiasts that have a Mongol theme. The Iron Hands, a cold and calculating chapter with a vehicle vibe. The Raven Guard, a covert and stealth themed chapter with an affinity for jump packs. The Imperial Fists, the defenders of terror, who excel with bolt weaponry. The Salamanders with their dragon heraldry, flame weapons and masterful craftsmanship. And the fanatical warriors of the Black Templars, who are on a permanent crusade to rid the galaxy of Xenos and heretics. In terms of the miniature range, the Space Marine range is pretty much second to none within 40k. They are pretty much the most popular faction, which means they get the most releases, which means that more people tend to collect them. Games Workshop is currently in process of updating as many sculpts as possible to new Primaris Space Marines, which are a bit upscaled compared with the old ones, and this has led to an enormous influx of new sculpts and models for them, so they truly have a ridiculous amount of options to choose from at the moment. Some of their models are a little bit dated, but in general they tend to have a very good range support, and have pretty much options to fill almost every battlefield role. In terms of price, because they tend to be in a lot of the discount value boxes, Space Marines are probably one of the cheapest armies to collect. In particular, they are in a few start collecting boxes, including start collecting Vanguard Space Marines, which is a great deal. In terms of playstyle, they tend to be well armoured and hard hitting, and generally quite elite armies, but you really can theme them in all sorts of different ways, as all the chapters have their own fighting styles. You could have a tank force, a biker hit and run army, or a large advancing gun line of power armour if you want to. There are plenty of dedicated melee specialists as well, and you don't usually want to tangle with Space Marines at close quarters. Currently, Space Marines are pretty much the strongest army in the game in 40k right now, with multiple units that are really quite undercosted, and the benefits of multiple overlapping special rules. They do have a codex coming out in around about a month's time as of recording this, which will be one of the first of 9th, and also adds quite a lot of new units, and update a lot of their older style Space Marines to be 2 wounds each. In general, Space Marines are a very good choice for a newer player. They receive a lot of support from Games Workshop, are relatively cheap to collect, and are fairly forgiving in playstyle in-game. The only downside is that you do tend to see quite a lot of Space Marine armies around, so people might find them a little bit less interesting to play compared with some other factions. I think a fair part of this sentiment comes from them being quite strong at the moment though, which isn't necessarily guaranteed to continue in the future. Next, let's go through some of the other major Space Marine chapters that have their own codex in 8th edition, though are being rolled into the main Space Marine codex going into 9th. They will still be getting their own books in the form of supplement books to the main codex Space Marines. First we have the Dark Angels, a monastic and secretive order of Space Marines from the homeworld of Caliban, and have the Primarch Lionel Johnson. Much of the Dark Angels' background and lore is the concealment of half of their chapter going renegade through the Horus Heresy, and their atonement by hunting down the traitor Marines. They are largely a codex chapter, but have 2 specialised companies in the Raven Wing and Deathwing, the Deathwing being their feared Terminator formation, of which you can see some on the right, and the Raven Wing being the black-clad bikers who hunt down the fallen Marines. They can use most of the Space Marine arsenal, but most of their unique options do tend to be fairly nice looking. Their line of unique plastic squads has aged fairly well, I think. Price-wise, they don't have a unique start collecting box of their own, which is a bit of a shame, but do have the advantage of being a fairly elite army, and can take advantage of some of the various start collecting boxes for the standard Space Marine army. In terms of playstyle, you can play them just as a fairly standard Space Marine chapter, but a lot of the draw to them comes from running either the Raven Wing and the Death Company. Raven Wing lists will be fairly stealthy biker lists that are very fast and incredibly hard hitting, and Deathwing are basically Terminators with more flexibility and some other cool options like these Deathwing Knights. Currently in 9th edition, they aren't exactly the strongest Space Marine chapter out there. They do have the advantage of the fairly decent Space Marine arsenal, but their unique units aren't doing amazingly right now, and if you are playing competitive Space Marines, people do tend to play other chapters at the moment. Overall though, a pretty epic Space Marine chapter with some really cool background. Next up we have the Space Wolves, who are a Nordic Viking-style Space Marine chapter from the planet of Fenris, and their Primarch is Leman Russ. As per their namesake, they have a slightly unhealthy fixation with wolves, being able to go into battle mounted on them as per these Thunderwolf cavalry here, and a genetic flaw within their gene seed means they often exhibit wolf-like traits, including elongated fangs, and if left to get out of hand, can allow a Space Wolf to degenerate into a half-werewolf-like creature known as a Wolfen. Miniature-wise, some of their sculpts are a little bit dated, particularly things like the Grey Hunters and Bloodclaws, which have been around for quite a while now, but again can access basically the entire Space Marine range as well, and all the goodness that's in that. Price-wise, they're a fairly cheap faction to play. For a sub-faction of Space Marines, they do quite well with not 1 but 2 start collecting boxes. In-game, they tend to be very heavily melee-orientated for Space Marines, though not without a few shooting tricks of their own, such as their powerful long-fanged Devastators. In general though, the main draw to Space Wolves are melee units such as Wolfen, Thunderwolf Cavalry, and they've got their own unique Dreadnoughts as well, which can pack a punch as well. Power-wise, I'd say they're fairly strong at the moment in 9th edition, partly just because of the way that the missions work, and the fact that armies need to get stuck in the centre of the table if they want to score maximal points. In recent times, they've received a new miniature of Ragnar Blackmane, who's quite powerful in game as well. and their Psychic Awakening update Saga of the Beast gave them some extra new powers, including options to make their characters incredibly dangerous in melee. Again, like Dark Angels, these are soon to be a supplement of Codex Space Marines itself, which will likely grant them a few more options compared with what they have now. If you like ferocious melee Space Marines, raiding Viking themes, or enormous wolves, then this might be the chapter for you. Next up we come to the Blood Angels, a heroic and noble Space Marine chapter that are affected by a tragic flaw in their gene seeds. The Blood Angels are forever haunted by the dying visions of their Primarch Sanguinius, who was slain by Horus the Warmaster himself during the Horus Heresy. Because of this, the Blood Angels can be unusually savage in melee combat, and must keep themselves in constant check against the Black Rage, a creeping madness that can leave them incapable of doing anything else bar fighting, and when this truly descends, they join the Death Company, wear the black-clad power armour, and seek a noble death in combat before they become a danger to their battle brothers. Like Dark Angels, their fellow Angels of Death, they broadly follow the teachings of the Codex Astartes with a few unique units and twists, including the aforementioned Death Company, their Sanguinary Guard, their unique Honour Guard, many special unique characters, and a unique version of the Predator, the Bile Predator. The kit's a sort of medium age for their unique options, and again they can use most of the standard Space Marine range too. Again, being an elite army, they're generally fairly cheap as it goes, and can use the Space Marine discount options too. And their playstyle tends to revolve around large units of jump pack marines descending from the skies to attack the enemy. Blood Angels are incredibly dangerous in melee, and are probably a bit better at getting there compared with Space Wolves, though maybe not quite as tough and durable as them. Blood Angels lists often tend to feature plenty of characters, as they have tons of options and have good synergy with buffing their dangerous units. Currently, I'd say again they are a fairly strong army in 9th edition, can access all the generic strong Space Marine choices, while also throwing some ludicrously dangerous power armoured jump pack marines at the enemy to help cut their foes off the objectives. Their most recent miniature update was a Primaris version of Chief Librarian Mephiston, and Blood of Bile really helped out the army quite a lot, taking them from a fairly weak faction to one that's far more reliable, with extra bonus to their charge, and a few powerful relics and stratagems. In particular, I think that Blood Angels could be an army to watch, particularly if their Death Company get 2 wounds at any point soon, as then they'll just be ludicrously dangerous in combat, and also a lot more durable to enemy return fire. I personally play Blood Angels myself, and I feel that they're a really dynamic, fun army to play both with and against. Lots of fast and punchy, hard-hitting units make for really quite a dynamic game. Next we have the Deathwatch, which are a bit of an unusual Space Marine organisation, in the fact that they're the Xenos Hunter wing of the Inquisition. The Deathwatch are drawn from numerous different Marine chapters, assembled for specific missions, and their warriors are clad in black with their own chapter heraldry on their right shoulder pad. The backbone of the Deathwatch armies tend to be kill teams, slightly eclectic mixes of different units for Space Marines, which are about some of the most flexible units in the entire game of 40k, being able to choose pretty much whatever war gear they want. In terms of their miniature range, all of their miniatures are fairly recent, but they are really quite a limited range overall. Their unique units only a couple of characters, this Kill Team box set that you can see on the right, which to be fair is a very good kit with loads of cool bits for customizing, and their own unique flyer, the Corvus Blackstar. Price-wise, the Veterans box only does get you a few Marines, but they are incredibly elite ones, and you can make your money go a fair way. They do have their own Start Collecting box if you do want a Dreadnought and Watch Captain Artemis as well, one of their characters. In terms of playstyle, Deathwatch with so few units are just a little bit limited. The core of your army is likely to revolve around squads of Space Marines with short-range special issue ammunition, deleting enemy infantry units at close range, though this might change a little bit with some of the new options that Deathwatch are getting access to from the new Space Marine Codex. They have been confirmed to be getting access to powerful new units from the Indomitus box, such as the Eradicators and Blade Guard veterans. Currently, I'd say the Deathwatch kill teams are very strong in these, though they are perhaps just a little bit limited in role, being very good at jumping down and destroying infantry, and often work quite well as allies to other Imperial forces, particularly ones that can deal with tanks well. In recent times, Deathwatch haven't received all that much love in terms of miniature releases. Their Psychic Awakening update earlier in the year was a White Dwarf article, and it was a little bit bland, only gaining access to generic Space Marine options, though admittedly gaining access to full unfiltered combat doctrines made the thing that they do best even better. It's going to be really interesting to see where they stand following the new Space Marine Codex update, which looks like it's going to give them an absolute ton of extra options to play with. Overall, if you like small squads of elite infantry, teleporting in and obliterating enemy infantry formations with some special tricks against aliens, then these guys could be one of the ones for you. Again, I do find their playstyle really quite fun. Now we come to the Grey Knights, the Demon Hunters of Titan, and one of the most secretive Space Marine chapters in the entire Imperium. These guys are elites beyond the remit of normal Space Marines, every single one of them being a powerful psyker, and never once has a Grey Knight fallen to chaos. The prognosticars of the Grey Knights divine where demon incursions are going to appear, dispatching small, very elite squads to seal incursions and cast the forces of the Dark Gods back into the warp. Again, much like Deathwatch, they haven't received all that many new releases since their big wave came out. The majority of their army can be built from the same Strike Squad and Terminator Squad kits, though they do also have a couple of unique characters, and also the big stompy Terminator carrier that is the Nemesis Dread Knight. I feel like price-wise, maybe I should have just given them a $1 sign. They are quite a cheap army to collect just because they're so elite, and buying Terminator boxes that could be fielded as paladins could get you a lot of points on the table for a very low price. In terms of playstyle, they don't play too dissimilarly from the Deathwatch. They often have small teleporting elite units, jumping down and hosing the enemy with close-range firepower. They're a bit less shooting-orientated than Deathwatch though. They do have some decent firepower, but also will be able to deploy several psychic tricks as well, and also have solid melee, as all of them carry force weapons. All of this does come at a price though. They are a very elite army indeed, and are usually outnumbered by whoever they're facing. Lately, they received their Psychic Awakening campaign update, which strengthened them a lot. They gained a unique army rule called Tides of the Warp, which can make them a lot more resilient to enemy shooting, or give them access to a few other strategies. The last miniature release that they had was Grandmaster Voldus, essentially a chief librarian sort of figure for them, though they have received one fairly hefty nerf in 9th edition, as they can no longer spam mortal wounds quite as easily with Smite, losing access to their special ability that let them repeatedly cast it without it getting harder. Despite this, I still think that Grey Knights are pretty strong competitively wise, most of their strength coming from decent sized units of Terminators and use of some of their Dread Knights. If you like an army that's incredibly elite and active in every phase of the game, then Grey Knights could be for you. Next up we have Adeptus Custodes, who are pretty much the Emperor's own personal Space Marine legion and are superior to Space Marines as much as a Space Marine is to a normal person. Every single Custode warrior essentially has the profile of a fighty character from another race, and it's not uncommon for armies of them to consist of 20 models or less at 2,000 points. The recent background has them leaving Terra and being dispatched on certain missions to dispatch the Emperor's will, so they are now just a little bit more active than just Guardians of the Throne. Their miniature range is really quite recent, lots of highly detailed and very cool plastic sculpts, not all that many coming from Games Workshop, but there are actually quite a lot of models coming from Forge World that can greatly expand their army if you want to. If you are using solely Games Workshop options, then Custodes are a bit limited really. They'll generally be elite infantry and jet bikes. Forge World provides a lot of their fire support platforms such as Caladius tanks and Pallas Gravitanks. If sticking to their core range within Games Workshop, they are again one of the most cheap armies that you can play in 40k. A few boxes of Custodian Guard can get you an absolute ton of points on the table for relatively little money investment, and it can mean that you can get them painted up really quite quickly. In terms of playstyles, they will generally be revolving around elite infantry at the moment. A common list might be a few squads of Custodian Guard, a big unit of Terminators to teleport in and take the fight to the enemy, and maybe a few Forge World fire support platforms hovering in the back. You can do a few different things though, such as mass Custodian jet bikes, which were a big thing in 8th edition, or lean very heavily into the Forge World fire support, which I have quite often seen being run in allies to other Imperial armies. Generally, Custodes are considered pretty strong at the moment, being very durable and hard-hitting in close combat, as well as having army-wide objective secured rules, means that they can do very well at 9th missions. A lot of the changes going into 9th edition have really helped them, and their recent Psychic Awakening book helped them out with a few different options, such as being able to take Assists of Silence for some anti-Psyker defense, and giving them a few new powerful stratagems for things like their Terminators and buffing their captains. If you like your troopers to be the absolute best of the best, enormous Baroque armour, slow-moving decent melee, and the colour gold, then Custodes might be for you. Now we'll leave Space Marines and Super Space Marines behind for the rest of the Imperium forces, starting out with the normal humans, the Astra Militarum. Also known as the Imperial Guard, these guys are the hammer of the Emperor, and by far the most numerous forces in the Imperium, making war with vast infantry formations, backed up by simple, easy-to-produce tanks and artillery. There's something very iconic about being a normal human armed with nothing more than a lasgun, facing off against a galaxy of horrors and superhumans, and it draws quite a lot of people to collect the faction. Astra Militarum regiments often echo real-world tropes again. There's quite a lot of flavour and diversity between them, although Games Workshop have stopped supporting the models for quite a few of them. One regiment of particular note are the Death Corps of Krieg, which are a Forge World regiment that have their own miniature line. Grim soldiers famed for their use of gas masks and artillery barrages, and have a bit of a World War I German aesthetic going on. It's a bit of an uncertain time for the Imperial Guard in the 41st millennium, as the Cadian Gate fell and destroyed the home world of one of the most famous Imperial Guard regiments. Miniature wise, the Guard range is one of the most extensive in 40k after the Space Marines, and they really do have quite a lot of options. That being said, quite a lot of them haven't been updated for a very long time indeed. Particularly the standard Cadian and Kaschan infantry models are showing their age quite a bit, and maybe aren't quite as detailed as some of the other more recent releases from Games Workshop. The Imperial Guard have a really good Forge World range as well, with all manner of super heavy tanks, air power, and some other lighter vehicles that you could add to your army if you wanted to. Price-wise, the Imperial Guard are one of the more expensive armies to collect in 40k. A lot of their stuff tends to be quite cheap points-wise, which means that you're going to have to invest in more models to get a functioning army out of them. Playstyle-wise, the Guard are well known for their horde infantry, powerful tanks and artillery, and you can really have any combination of the above three, being able to deploy huge sprawling infantry formations, massive tank companies, or entire squadrons of artillery as you see fit. You can also go down a bit of a mechanised infantry approach, or use air cavalry with things like Tempestus Scions and Stormtroopers deploying from the skies. Currently power-wise, they do have a fair few options, though 9th edition hasn't been particularly kind to them. They do have some certain very powerful units such as tank commanders and things like manticores with the full payload upgrade. I do think they kind of match up badly against marines though, with bolters being very good at shredding infantry and lascans chewing through tanks quite easily, and marines are kind of everywhere at the moment. In terms of recent support, Games Workshop released their Psychic Awakening update, which gave them access to these tank ace abilities, which can be really quite powerful for your tank commanders or artillery platforms, though they haven't received an absolute ton of models in recent times. The latest two being a couple of unique Kaschan sculpts, which were only available temporarily as event-exclusive miniatures. In general, if you like a bit more real-world theme to the military, or just want to empathise with the actual humans who have to live in the horror that is the 41st millennium, then the Imperial Guard might be an army that you're interested in. Next we come to the Adepta Sororitas, also known as the Sisters of Battle. They recently had an entire army refresh, as a lot of their range were metal miniatures dating back absolutely ages, and in the background they're a well-equipped army of all-female warrior nuns, the fighting arm of the ecclesiarchy and protectors of the imperial faith. Much like Space Marines, they're clad in power armour and carry bolt guns, so they are really quite elite infantry, and tend to excel with melter and flamer weapons, all the better for purging witches and traitors up close and personal. Their miniature range is pretty outstanding to be honest. Games Workshop did a proper full army update for them and gave them an absolute ton of options and range, and I must say a lot of their sculpts are absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately this all does come with a bit of a price though. Newer kits tend to be a little bit more expensive, so I would say that Adeptus Sororitas do tend to be one of the more expensive armies if you want to get a massive army of them together. The Sisters do have a few interesting options with playstyles, although most of them will revolve around some sort of bolter battle line, as a lot of their synergies work with foot-slogging Sisters best. However, they do have some very powerful melee units such as Zephyrim, Sisters Repentia, and the very disturbing Penitent Engines or Mortifiers, and they have a few cool in-game mechanics such as their Miracle Dice, which can be expended to get small bonuses to the army, representing the Emperor's will making itself manifest and making some impossible situations possible. In-game, they're currently a fairly strong army as it goes. Hard-hitting close-range firepower units with plenty of bodies for objectives are good in 9th, though I'd argue that they are still a little bit behind Space Marines power-wise, maybe partly due to them just not having quite as many options. Overall, I would say that Sisters of Battle are a really good army to collect right now. They've got a good, well-written codex, really nice models, fun game mechanics, and at least fairly powerful in-game. Probably the main downside is the fact that they're at least fairly expensive. Next up we have the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are often referred to colloquially as AdMech. The Scutari and Cult Mechanicus forces are the military wing of the Tech Priests of Mars, hailing from and defending the Forge Worlds, where the Imperium makes all of its war gear. Their warriors are extensively augmented by bionics, often cutting off and replacing limbs with more powerful mechanical ones, and they make war with all kinds of arcane technology, with everything from hovercraft to bat-winged flyers, legged walkers and mechanical horses. They definitely have a bit of a steampunk vibe going on with them. I must say that despite the variation within the range, I really do quite like the miniatures for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Like Sisters of Battle, they were a fairly recent army release, and now have a very decent amount of kits to fill out different battlefield roles. Again, similar to the Sisters, they are quite an expensive army to collect, partly because of new shiny plastic kits, but also because their units are often fairly cheap points-wise in-game, meaning that you might still need a fair few of them to fill out a 2,000 point army, if that's what you're going for. Playstyle-wise, at the moment I think they're in quite a good place to be fairly varied. They certainly can make some incredibly powerful gun lines with synergies within their codex, but they have plenty of fast, hard-hitting melee options too, such as the Fulguride's Electro Priests, which can jump out of transports and carve the enemy up. Currently, I'd say they're a fairly strong faction within 40k. Their recent update with Psychic Awakening Engine War gave them a bunch of new units and lots of interesting ways to use their existing ones, including things like custom Forge Worlds and some very powerful Warlord traits. I'm a big fan of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though I don't play them myself. Really nice models, good fun rules, and some interesting and very disturbing background. Next up we have the Imperial Knights, the titanic war machines of the Imperium, which are basically knightly households piloting enormous super heavy suits of armour. These guys are pretty much mini titans that you can play in normal games of 40k, and certainly make for some very different games, although they do sometimes have the potential to make games a little bit one-dimensional, basically whether or not your opponent can deal with these enormous super heavy threats, or if they don't have enough anti-tank firepower to deal with them. In terms of miniatures, from Games Workshop they only really have 3 plastic kits, though all of which are really quite cool ones, and have multiple ways that you can build them. They have the smaller Armiger class knights, the standard Questoris class, and also the larger Dominus class knights that you can see over here on the right, bristling with an absolute ton of heavy firepower. Because the knights cost quite so many points in game, they are one of the cheaper and easier options to jump into 40k with. You only need to paint up a few models, even if they are big ones. Playstyle wise, they are just a bit limited due to the actual nature of the army. You're still going to be fielding super heavy walkers in one way or another. Probably the biggest variations is as to whether or not you go for a lot of the smaller Armiger class walkers, or if you add in some other allies to go alongside them. Things like Astra Militarum or Adeptus Mechanicus work quite well. Knights I think can really benefit from a few units running around to secure objectives, while their main stompy walkers go after the enemy. After being very competitive for most of 8th edition, I think that Knights are just a little bit weaker in 9th, partly due to the mission types and the new terrain changes, though they did get treated fairly well in terms of points changes. Unfortunately their Psychic Awakening update wasn't the most overwhelming, to be honest, not really adding all that much stuff that you'd actually want to use compared with the stuff in their codex. In general though, Imperial Knights can be a very quick way to jump into 40k. The models really do look pretty awesome, and it can be quite fun to command the shock factor of a unit that's quite so devastating both at range and in melee. Finally for the Imperium, we have the loose umbrella term for Agents of the Imperium, which are basically some of the units from the Imperium that tend to work as allies rather than armies in their own right. Here we have things like the Forces of the Inquisition, the shadowy organisation that weeds out traitors and heretics from within the ranks of the Imperium itself, the Officio Assassinorum, the various assassin temples, which you can add one model to your army to go and hunt down enemy characters, and the more recently released Demonifuge Ephrael Stern, assists a battle character with some unnatural near-psychic powers. Miniatures wise, they're a bit of a mixed bag. The Demonifuge and Assassins are very recent miniatures, and the Inquisition are a bit mixed. Greyfax, Eisenhorn, and Kyria Draxus, all very recent miniatures, when there are some quite old and venerable models in there, such as Inquisitor Kotias here. Price-wise, you might not get all that much plastic for your money, but you do get a fair amount of points on the tabletop. And in terms of playstyle, they're more about what they can add to your army, rather than trying to be an army in their own right. Certain assassins can be very useful depending on what your army lacks, such as a Vindicator being able to pop off some enemy characters from long range, a Calexus being able to foil enemy psychic shenanigans, or maybe some Inquisitors to add some psychic might to your army. In game, they're by no means auto-include, otherwise they probably would be run by basically every Imperium army, but I think that in certain situations they can make very good sense to include in an army. They were fairly recently updated in the last few Psychic Awakening books. The rules did make it a bit easier to field them. You can now include them really easily within detachments, as well as their rules having been updated to work with the latest edition of the game. In general, I'd see these guys as fun, fluffy allies that you can add to your army, or could potentially cover some sort of tactical weakness. So now we're leaving the Imperium behind and heading into Chaos. First of all, we have the archetypical bad guys of 40k, the Chaos Space Marines, the same genetically engineered super soldiers who turned from the Emperor's light in favour of worshipping the dark gods of chaos. Defeated in the Horus heresy, they were exiled to the Eye of Terror for millennia and now have broken loose once more with the opening of the Great Rift. Chaos Space Marines tend to operate more in raiding and opportunistic war bands, and over the millennia their war gear and fighting style has differed quite a lot from the Loyalists. Many of their troops have demonic enhancements or mutations, and their warp smiths have created many disturbing demon war machines, twisted fusions of warp spawn and science. These Chaos Havocs on the right are from the Black Legion, the former Legion of Horus, now headed by Abaddon the Despoiler, who could be argued to be one of the main bad guys of all of 40k. Miniatures wise, they did receive quite a lot of updates fairly recently, with units like Havocs, Obliterators and Standard Chaos Marines getting a nice update, but there are still a few relics within the range, some very old kits for Noise Marines and Khorne Berserkers for example. In general, as an elite army, they're not the most expensive in the world, and in particular, start collecting Chaos Space Marines is one of the very best deals that Games Workshop offers in terms of money for plastic and points. Playstyle wise, Chaos function fairly similar to standard Marines, being both elite, hard hitting and decent in melee and at range, though Chaos do tend to favour melee a fair bit over range compared with their loyalist counterparts. I'd say often Chaos choices don't tend to be quite as efficient as standard Space Marines on the table. They'll often need to rely on more sort of synergy options such as stratagems and psychic powers to really make their units work well. You can do a fair few different builds with them though. You can make Demon Engine type lists, you can use plenty of Forgeable Dreadnoughts, or you could have Rhino Rushes with lots of Khorne Berserkers inside them. In the scheme of things, currently I'd say they're around about medium power. They just don't have as many overlapping special rules as their loyalist cousins. I think they need a little bit more careful play and forethought when building lists if you want to do well with them. In terms of recent updates, they had a decent range refresh 2 years ago with the kits that we mentioned, and Faith and Fury, their Psychic Awakening update, did add a bunch of really quite cool sub-faction rules, relics and stratagems. Whenever Games Workshop finishes rolling out the 2 wounds for all Space Marines rule, then I think that the Chaos are going to be big beneficiaries of this, both with their standard rank and file Chaos Marines and also all of their special cult options. In general, if you want a melee slant of Space Marines, with all the fun that comes with worshipping ancient evil deities, then Chaos Marines might be for you. Next up we come to the Death Guard, basically the expanded full faction rules for one Legion of Chaos Space Marines, much in the way that the Loyalists have expanded rules for armies such as Space Wolves and Blood Angels. The Death Guard are the Legion of Mortarion, and their Legion of Plague Marines is bound to the service of Nurgle, the Chaos God of rot, decay and disease, their warriors being twisted, infested husks, and they make war with all manner of disease warfare, spreading decay and horror wherever they go. Miniatures wise, besides a couple of exceptions, they're pretty much entirely new for the start of 8th edition 40k, a pretty decent fully fleshed out army with plenty of nice plastic kits, including these Plague Marines, a couple of variants of Terminator, Mortarion and a bunch of Demon Engines. In 8th edition they were one of the cheapest armies that you could play, as you could very easily get hold of them in the starter boxes such as Dark Imperium and No Fear, and if you can find these kits or people selling them second hand on eBay, then they could still be a very cheap faction to start. Playstyle wise, they're pretty disgustingly resilient, typically characterised by a slow moving advance, with units such as Plague Marines and their Demon Engines moving forward, dealing damage and soaking up an insane amount of firepower. You can go quite heavy down either the infantry or the Demon Engine route, so I say there's 2 main ways to play the army at the moment, and I would say that in 9th edition they're one of the stronger armies in the game. Walking onto objectives, dealing damage and not dying can get you very far, and a bunch of the core changes to 9th really have helped out their demon units. In addition to this, their latest update in War of the Spider gave them an absolute ton more stratagems, and now there's more command points available in 9th edition for them. That's only been a good thing. And from a previous Games Workshop tease, we know that there's at least one new character on the way for them, potentially a multi-part Lord of Contagion. If you like the idea of a disgusting, infested army of unkillable Space Marines inexorably advancing towards the foe to bring death and despair, then the Death Guard might be for you. Next up we come to the Thousand Sons, another one of the core traitor legions, hailing from the world of Prospero that was destroyed by the Space Wolves, and under the rule of their Primarch Magnus the Red. In the days of the Horus heresy, their sorcerous ways led to Tzeentch blessing them with far too many mutations, to the extent where their legion was starting to break down. The sorcerer Ahriman cast an incantation that stopped this by turning all the Thousand Sons Space Marines essentially into dust, and the majority of their legion is now magically animated, hollow sets of armour. Only their sorcerers retain their humanity, and these still commands their undying legions into battle. They definitely have a bit of an Egyptian theme going on with the style of their armour. These guys had a very similar release to the Death Guard, basically a fully realised sub-faction within Chaos Space Marines that came out in 7th edition. Again, they've got some very nice, good recent plastic sculpts, decently detailed, particularly these very nice Rubric Marines and their Scarab of the Cult Terminators. Price-wise, I would put them cheap to medium. If you mainly build around the Rubric Marines and Terminators, then they can be fairly cheap in terms of pounds per point, though things can get a little bit more expensive if you use quite a lot of their Abhuman Zangors. In-game, Thousand Sons are pretty much reliant on the Psychic phase for the majority of their tricks and strategies, and arguably some of the most powerful Psykers in all of 40k. Most Thousand Sons lists will now use a fairly decent battle line of Rubric Marines, supported with a good complement of Sorcerers, and maybe having a few Zangor units in support. Currently in 9th edition, I'd say they're about medium sort of power level. The changes to their Psychic phase and not being able to multicast Smite really haven't helped them so much, and in general I feel their Sorcerers tend to do a bit better when they're allied with other Chaos factions rather than just being a whole army all on their own. They haven't had all that many releases for them recently, although Games Workshop ported the Mutalith Vortex Beast from Age of Sigmar, which did give them a sort of Demon Engine type thing, although it's a bit questionable exactly how much it fits in with their aesthetic. If you like the thought of a dusty, clanking automata striding towards the foe mercilessly, while you have multiple strong psykers casting all sorts of tricks from behind them, then the Thousand Sons could be a good army to pick. Next we come to the servants of the warp themselves, the Chaos Demons. The Demons of Chaos are the followers of the Gods of Chaos, who live within warp space, basically an alternate dimension within 40k that bleeds over into the physical world all too often, with great incursions of howling horrors descending on an unsuspecting galaxy. Chaos Demons are generally manifestations of the great Gods of Chaos themselves: Khorne, the god of anger and bloodlust; Nurgle, disease and decay; Slaanesh, hedonism and indulgence; and Tzeentch, trickery, magic and mutation. These are very much otherworldly, pure evil made manifest, and an existential threat to the galaxy. Miniatures wise, they're a bit of a mixed bag. They have had several recent updates in terms of plastic kits, and the majority of their range is plastic now. Some of them are showing their age a little bit more than others, but in particular the Greater Demons and some of their more recent revamped ones, such as the Keeper of Secrets, Fleshhounds and Fiends of Slaanesh, are pretty good quality recent plastic sculpts. Price-wise, they don't tend to be the most expensive army in the world, but if you are going for lots of lesser demons, then you will need quite a lot of them. In terms of playstyle, basically all the four gods have their own particular way of making war. Khorne units tend to be incredibly hitty in close combat, but not all that hard to kill, and not all that fast either. Slaanesh are generally good in combat, and very, very fast, but maybe not with quite the same amount of raw strength as Khorne has. Nurgle's all about slow hordes of plague bearers shuffling up the board and regenerating wounds, and Tzeentch has bounding hordes of horrors and flamers spitting warp fire at the enemy and casting numerous spells. Currently in game, I'd say they're sort of moderate to weak on the power level spectrum, though they do have some very powerful options when allied with other chaos lists, things like Nurglings or certain allied heralds and units that can make a big impact. Their Psychic Awakening update was a bit of a weird one. It didn't do all that much to buff the majority of their army, but it gave them some really powerful buffs to their Greater Demons. By taking a lot of exalted Greater Demons, you can make a pretty cool monster mash list now, fielding a bunch of Bloodthirsters, Keepers of Secrets or Lords of Change for example. Chaos Demons are also equally usable in Age of Sigmar as they are in 40k, so if you do feel like amassing a horde of horrors, then it's quite good that you could jump between the two game systems if you wanted to. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, we come to the Chaos Knights, who are basically similar to their Imperial counterparts, who have felt the draw of chaos. There are many reasons that they might have fallen, either from a draw of personal power, going renegade and turning their backs on the Imperium, or feeling the temptations of any one of the four Chaos Gods. Many of them have demonic upgrades and unnatural abilities their loyalist counterparts do not have. Miniatures wise, they're kind of only really one miniature at the moment, which is this one that you can see on the right, and it is quite cool. This guy essentially builds a couple of the more standard Chaos Knight variants, though if you want some of the other options from within the codex, such as the War Dogs, their version of the Knight Armigers, or Knight Tyrants, their version of the Dominus Big Knights, you do basically just have to use the Imperial kit and put some extra spikes or conversion work into it. Again, price-wise they aren't all that bad, seeing as you can get quite a lot of points on the table for not all that many miniatures, and playstyle-wise they're fairly similar to their Imperial counterparts. You'll typically be fielding a few big super heavy walkers, maybe with a few smaller war dogs on the side. Again, they can ally with other Chaos factions, things like Lord Discordants and Demon Engines being fairly popular to add in, going down the same theme. Again, I wouldn't say they're the strongest faction in the game at the moment. They only received a small but meaningful buff from Engine War, and they're just not all that proficient at the 9th edition Eternal War missions. In any case though, they're certainly an incredibly imposing sight on the other side of the table, and commanding a whole bunch of super heavy murder machines is really good fun. Now we move into the forces of the Xenos, and we'll start with the Eldari or Eldar forces. First of all we have the Craftworld Eldar, some of the last remnants of a shattered species of space elves that predated humanity's rise to ascendance within the galaxy. Fleeing the fall of their empire that birthed the Chaos God Slaanesh, these enigmatic and aloof aliens ply the void on giant starships called Craftworlds. Every citizen a master of innumerate skills and able to take up arms in defence of the Craftworld should it be needed. Many of their war machines are crewed by basic citizens, who fight alongside aspect warriors of the various forms of Kayla Men-Shadakane, their god of war who survived the fall via might, and they are also a very psychically active race with Farseers to guide them to victory, or cast powerful battle magic when they're threatened. Miniatures wise, the Craftworlds haven't seen all that many updates in quite a while. Many of their vehicles, jetbikes and characters are relatively recent, but most of their Aspect Warrior range is really dated indeed, only the Howling Banshees and Dire Avengers having proper plastic kits, everything else having to make do with old resin kits. Price wise, as a fairly elite army, they're not the most expensive in the world, but maybe a little bit more so than armies like Space Marines have multiple different ways to get discounts. In terms of playstyle, they do have a fair few different ways that you can go with them. Vehicle-heavy lists with a few flyers tend to be quite strong at the moment. You can invest in their reanimated Wraith constructs with Wraith Guards, Wraith Lords and Wraith Knights, and have a more slower and ponderous Walker army, or you can utilise some of their many forms of Aspect Warrior, with units such as Dark Reapers and Shining Spears having been quite scary throughout 8th edition. At present, between a bunch of points changes and also a fair few nerfs to their more powerful units, the Craftworlds aren't one of the strongest races, but certainly can still pack a punch and have some powerful synergy options with their Psykers. Their Psychic Awakening update gave them a few new tricks, including some Exarch powers and custom Craftworlds, as well as finally some new sculpts for the Howling Banshees and one of their Phoenix Lords, Jane Czar, though both of these are hampered by some slightly underwhelming rules. In general, for collecting them, Craftworld Eldar have quite a lot going for them. Lots of different playstyles and some very nice miniatures, and a history of being fairly strong in the game, even if they might be going through a bit more of a rough spot right now. Next we have their Dark Kin, the Drukhari, which are essentially Dark Elves in space. Where the Craftworlds fled the decline and fall of their civilization into depravity, the Drukhari revelled in it, surviving the fall by retreating to their webway city of Comera, and darting forth with it in devastating real space raids, to inflict pain and fear on an unsuspecting planetary population and carry captives back to the Dark City to slake their thirst for pain and suffering. Pray they don't take you alive. Miniatures wise, they had a range refresh somewhere around 10 years ago now, and pretty much had an entire army of new plastic kits at around about that time. Since then, they've only really had fairly sporadic updates, including a new Drazar and an Incubi kit, which I think for the most part the spiky elves do hold up pretty well. There are just a couple of fine cast models left, such as Mandrakes, which could really do with an update. Price-wise, I put them at moderate to fairly expensive. Not quite as bad as some, but again they're one of the armies that has fairly cheap points costs unit per unit, which does add up to needing quite a lot of units to make a full list. In terms of playstyles, they have 3 main archetypes within the army: the Warrior Cabals, the more martial sort of force of the Dark Eldar, often consisting of warriors mounted in raiders and venoms; the Witch Cults of the gladiatorial combat arenas that you can see plenty of on the right here; and the Homunculi Covens, the flesh crafters and artisans, who often accompany raiding parties with big hefty sewn together creations made from other captured beings. The Homunculi with their talus and racks are a bit more ponderous, but the others are generally fairly fast and hard hitting, although fairly fragile to return enemy fire. They're generally very mobile and have a high number of skimmers, and make extensive use of poison and lance weaponry. Currently, I'd say that Drukhari are a moderate power level army. A lot of their units receive very hefty points increases, but their mobility can make up for it for a fair bit, particularly with an experienced player playing the mission well. I'd say they're definitely a bit less beginner friendly than quite a lot of other armies. The Dark Eldar are certainly a fast and dynamic army, very hard hitting and requiring a fair amount of good generalship. Next up we have Harlequins, a smaller sub-faction within the Eldar race, who are enigmatic masked guardians of the Black Library, the repository of Eldar lore and forbidden knowledge that resides within the webway. These mysterious performers are warriors near without peer, to the extent where they make war with a sort of choreographed dance of performance, cutting through and over enemy infantry formations with rapturous ease. Their miniatures are fairly recent sculpts as they go, though they only have 3 plastic kits in this troop that you see here, the Skyweaver jet bikes and their transport. Besides that, there's just a few characters, making them a very small army with limited options. Again, I'd say they're fairly moderately priced, being at least fairly elite as an army, though lacking a start collecting box certainly doesn't do them any favours. Their playstyle is a little bit limited, and generally revolves around very fast-moving units jumping in and out of enemy formations, and being able to thoroughly confound and confuse the enemy. They have plenty of nasty tricks, such as reducing the range of their weapons, running away after they've been in combat, and being basically impossible to tie up. Generally, if you want a full Harlequin army though, you will need at least some troops, jet bikes and skimmers backed up by a few characters. Currently, despite their paucity of options, they are very strong in-game. 9th missions working out pretty well for them, with their crazy mobility and being very hard-hitting, and a lot of the options from their Psychic Awakening update really added to their strength. If you like the idea of a whole load of masked elf clowns dancing their way through the enemy, cutting them to ribbons, then Harlequins might be the army for you. Next we have the Ynari, the subset of Eldar that follows the god of the dead, Ynid, that has been steadily growing in the warp with the decline of the Eldar race. It is the hope of the Eldar that the god will one day become strong enough to cast down Slaanesh itself, and the Ynari have convinced many Eldar to follow them, both from the Craftworlds, Drukhari and Harlequins. Miniatures wise, this means that they can be quite freeing. They only really have these 3 unique miniatures of their own, including the Incarn, Yvrain and the Vizarch, but they can basically use the vast majority of the whole Eldar range, barring a few miniatures such as the Homunculi Covens and also the Phoenix Lords. In general, the Ynari swap these core benefits that the armies get for basically a buff to melee close combat. It means they can be a fairly viable option for melee-focused Eldar armies, and there's not as much reason to take them if you're not taking melee units, though in general they don't tend to be quite as strong as just fielding the units from their given codexes and just having the benefits from being Craftworlds, Drukhari or Harlequins. The Ynari used to be some of the strongest armies in the game in 8th edition, but they removed one of their core mechanics, which was basically to be able to activate an entire unit again to be able to shoot twice or assault twice, for example, which was just ludicrously strong, and it really was a big power come down when they got changed to their current edition of rules. In any case, they can be quite a fun option for making a mixed detachment of Eldar, and gives you an excuse to use some different cool colour schemes. Moving on to the other Xenos races now, we have the Tyranids. These are the slavering aliens from beyond the void, arriving out of the blue with hive fleets, consuming all life on entire worlds before moving on to their next targets. They're another great existential threat to the galaxy, as no one knows just how many are out there, and each hive fleet that arrives takes a great cost to defeat. Miniatures wise, they have a fairly decent range, including plenty of large and small critters, although particularly some of the smaller swarms are starting to show their age a bit, and they haven't had any meaningful updates to their army in quite a long time. I'd again peg them up as one of the more moderate price armies, not overly expensive but not overly cheap, and they can do a fair few different playstyles within the army, such as having in massive swarms of smaller bugs, mass Genestealers just charging forward to shred the enemy, or have a more Nidzilla approach, where you take a bunch of Carnifexes and the other bigger bugs. In more recent times, some of the most effective Tyranid lists tend to use things like Hive Guard and Zoanthropes, and focus on some of the more medium-sized critters as well. So I would say there is quite a bit of variety, even if they're not all that strong at the moment. Tyranids have been in a bit of a rough spot for the vast majority of 8th edition, and that's continuing into 9th I think. Really, I think they could either just use some new rules, or some decent points reductions in plenty of their units. If you want to command an overwhelming horde of alien horrors to overrun and destroy the enemy, then the Tyranids might be a good choice. Next up we have the Tyranid worshipping Genestealer Cults, who are a relatively new re-addition to Warhammer 40K, and are an army that the Tyranids can ally with. In the background, Genestealer Cults are seeded by a Patriarch, a specialised brew lord of the Tyranids, who stows away onto a planet and then begins to affect and create a cult of followers around him with mutated humans, and his psychic presence causing humans to worship both him and the oncoming star gods that the cult believes is its salvation from this life. As the Tyranid hive fleet draws near, a Genestealer cult will break loose, rising up to throw down their oppressors and welcome their waiting star gods, making the efficient devoural and consumption of the world by the Tyranids all the easier. Miniature-wise, the Genestealer cults take the form of sort of mutated humans with large heads and sometimes Tyranid appendages. The ones that Games Workshop chose to go with are sort of like a mutated mining cult, bearing a lot of pickaxes, rock drills, things like that. The miniatures really are quite recent and new, very detailed, but also really quite expensive, which is quite problematic when Genestealer cults often need quite a lot of miniatures to make a fully functioning army. So I would peg them as one of the most expensive factions in all of 40k at the moment. In particular, Genestealer Cult Acolytes are some of the most expensive troops per point in the whole game. Their playstyle tends to revolve around sneaky tricks and guerrilla warfare, big units of hard-hitting infantry appearing out of nowhere to charge and kill the enemy in close combat. In general, they have been fairly strong throughout 8th edition, though at the moment I would say they're one of the weaker factions in the game, unfortunately. They've received a lot of punishing points hikes, and don't match up all that well against the ubiquitous Space Marines, meaning that playing Genestealer Cult is pretty much playing 40k on hard mode at the moment. I think they're one of the armies though that a few decent points cuts could really make them very strong very quickly. In recent times, unfortunately their Psychic Awakening update didn't really do all that much for them. It's added in some fun options, but maybe not necessarily all that many ones that you'd actually want to take. They have gained this Start Collecting box that you can see on the right though, which does help make them a little bit less expensive, as it does include some of their core units that you'd want multiple copies of. If you want to play as a ragtag bunch of abhumans rising up to overthrow the oppressors with various sneaky tricks and demo charges, then consider the Genestealer Cults. Next up we come to the Orks, one of the iconic races of 40k. Orks are a violent clan-based mob of greenskins that fight for the sheer joy of it and make brutal war on the other races just because they enjoy it. Typical Orc armies will have huge hordes of boys backed up by clanking war machines maintained by enthusiastic mechanics, often sporting guns that are more loud than they are dangerous, before getting into the proper work of chopping people up with big axes. Orcs make war in great War Holy Crusades, led by a war boss with some vision of spreading some unholy greenskin destruction across entire sections of the galaxy. Miniatures-wise, their range is a bit of a mixed bag. A lot of their units are fairly old, but hold up fairly well I would say, though there still are a few resin squads out there, such as their commandos and tank busters. I'd say Orks are moderately to fairly expensive as an army. You do tend to require quite a lot of units just because they're quite cheap per model due to the ragtag nature of their gear and technology. Orks do have a fair few different cool distinct playstyles, including Green Tide, where you just take an absolutely enormous amount of boys and charge headlong at the enemy. You can make dread mobs or mech focused lists with large amounts of walkers and crackling mech guns, or you could go down a bit of a speed freak approach, take lots of war bikes and a bunch of their war buggies that they had nice new models for recently. I'd say currently they're moderate in terms of power. They have received a bunch of nerfs going into 9th edition, including their main boy squads and plenty of their other powerful units, but I still think there is a lot of strength within the codex, though I suspect that Ork lists might be a little bit more mechanised than they were before. Most recently they received a shiny new Ghazghkull miniature, which is actually really quite a force to be reckoned with in 8th and 9th edition. Their war machines got some nice buffs in Saga of the Beast, being able to take some fun and flavourful custom jobs to make them a bit more powerful in game. And Games Workshop has teased there's at least one Ork miniature on the way, whether it's a character or an update for the boys kit or something, we don't know, but there's at least some kind of update inbound. In general, I'd say that Ork armies tend to be a fairly fun army to play with and against. Fairly random units and a whole load of close combat troops charging towards you usually makes for a pretty fun game, and they're really quite good fun miniatures to build and paint as well. Next up we have the Necrons, an ancient race of semi-living machines, reawakening amongst their vast tomb worlds to purge the lesser races from the galaxy and re-establish their fragmented galactic empire. The Necrons were once flesh and blood, but their star gods, the Catan, offered them immortality, trading their flesh for living metal, but also turning the vast amount of the Necrontyr into shambling automatons, no longer capable of independent thought. They make war with powerful and unknowable technology, Gauss weapons that disintegrate the foe at the molecular level, and supported by enormous and murderous canoptic constructs. The Necrons definitely have a bit of an Egyptians in space theme going on, though they still have a style all of their own. The Necrons are very much one of the primary antagonists of the new edition of 40k, and they're currently enjoying a recent influx of an absolutely massive amount of new kits to their range. They really do have quite a lot of options, and they have a codex on the way shortly, with which we should be able to access some of the new kits such as the new Monolith, Void Dragon Catan miniature, and also the Silent King. This new wave has pretty much retired the vast majority of the old Necron kits, and they're looking quite modern as a faction at the moment. As a relatively elite army, they do tend to be at least fairly reasonably priced comparatively, and their gameplay broadly revolves around short-ranged firepower with mass ranks of infantry, though they do have a fairly decent motor pool, and there are powerful options such as the one that was run in 8th edition with the Doomsize and Doomsday arcs, just obliterating parts of the opponent's army with energy weapons. In 9th edition they have gained a fair few new close combat units, including those very scary Scorpec destroyers, so maybe melee Necrons might be a bit more of a thing in 9th edition. Despite this influx of new options, I would say that Necrons are currently quite weak, partly because they didn't actually receive anything meaningful in terms of a Psychic Awakening update, though I strongly suspect that they'll gain a lot more power when they get their codex. If you'd like to command some soulless phalanxes of undead robots, grimly cutting down the lesser races with energy weapons and getting straight back up once they die, then the Necrons are a good choice. Last but not least, for the main armies, we come to the Tau Empire. The Tau are a young, vibrant and dynamic race with an affinity for technology and a spirit of constant innovation that very much is at odds with the Imperium's technical stagnation. They have a caste system with earth, water, air and fire caste, their warriors, all presided over by an ethereal supercaste that command them in their expansion for the greater good. They deploy plenty of battle suits and have a bit of a manga sort of style about them, with big war suits obliterating their enemy with high-tech weaponry. Their miniatures for the most part are fairly decent and up to date, some of their more recent updates being this squad of Strike Fire Warriors and also redone XV8 battlesuits. Again, I put them at moderately priced for Warhammer, as you can get quite a lot of points on the table for some of their bigger suits. Playstyle wise, their Tau are slightly unusual in 40k in that they have almost no melee threat whatsoever. They're pretty much exclusively ranged. They do have faction-wide Overwatch to help mitigate this though, and most of the time their strategy is going to revolve around certain big battlesuits, laying their enemy low with energy weapons while supported by various drones. You can do some slightly alternative lists though, such as with their alien auxiliaries and have a whole lot of Kroot on the go, or use some hyper-elite crisis units deep striking next to the enemy. Currently I put towers at a fairly moderate power level. They are powerful in terms of shooting, but might struggle to score objectives quite as well as they don't really want to be going towards the enemy. Most recently they got some experimental weapons updates from the Greater Good Psychic Awakening book, as well as a nice new miniature for Commander Shadowsun. And if you like laying your foe low with energy weapons at long range, then Tau might be a good pick. I would say that they do have a bit of a history of being slightly frustrating to play against, as they will historically tend to win ranged firefights, so they can be slightly non-engaging to play against if you are trying to play some sort of melee list. Finally, I thought we'd round up with a few more honourable mentions that don't really fit into the above categories. Forge World do make a bunch of really big titans that sort of are their own army, but you're not really very likely to see them in normal games outside of the very biggest and more casual ones. There's a couple of technical kill team factions in the Rogue Traders that you can see on the right, Imperial Explorers and Adventurers, and in the same kill team box as them you've got the Gellerpox Infected, basically human mutated followers of Nurgle, that represent a lot of the ship's crew fallen to a mysterious space plague. Both of them can be used in Warhammer 40k, though aren't necessarily all the strongest. There are a few Forge World armies that were discontinued over the years, most recently the Elysian Drop Troops and Renegades and Heretics, both of which had army lists in 8th edition, but might well not in 9th edition, unless they gain some sort of rules in Warhammer Legends again. Eldar Corsairs were also a faction that were unfortunately discontinued previously. There are a few unaligned units that don't really fit into any faction, such as Ambles and Spindle Drones that came out in Blackstone Fortress, and Games Workshop does always have the potential to release new factions. I wouldn't be too surprised if we see either Traitor Guard, Emperor's Children or World Eaters in the coming years. So I hope you've enjoyed the rundown of every faction in 40k and reasons that you might or might not want to collect them. Obviously the choice is going to come down to personal preference, what sort of things vibe with you, and whether you're more interested in the lore, the miniatures or the gameplay. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We do regularly keep 40k content coming on the channel, including plenty of other starter type videos like this. If you'd like to say thank you and help support the channel, I do have that Element Games affiliate link down in the video description below. If you did happen to buy anything through that, a small amount goes to help support the channel. In addition, the channel does have a Patreon page as well. Again, you can find that in the video description. If you feel like helping out the creation of new videos, then channel Patreons also get a bunch of extra benefits as well, such as seeing a video a week early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next in the channel, and also entry into the channel's monthly prize draw. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help out, feel free to take a look at the link in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.